The Magic Mountain, Part 2. The Baptismal Bowl. Grandfather in his two forms. Hans Castorp retained only faint recollections of his actual parental home. He had hardly known his father and mother. They had both dropped dead within the brief period between his 5th and 7th years of life. His mother had died first, quite unexpectedly, while awaiting the birth of a second child, of an arterial blockage caused by phlebitis, an embolism Dr. Heidekind had called it, triggering instantaneous cardiac paralysis. She had been sitting up in bed, laughing, and it looked as if she simply toppled over in a fit of laughter, whereas, in fact, she did it because she was dead. It was not something that Hans Hermann Castorp, the father, found easy to understand, and since he had been very fond of his wife and was not the most robust man himself, he simply did not know how to get over it. From then on, his mind was muddled, his focus narrow, and in his befuddlement he made mistakes in his business, resulting in serious losses for the firm of Castorp and Son. While inspecting a harbor warehouse on a windy day the following spring, he caught pneumonia, and since, despite all the conscientious attention given him by Dr. Heidekind, his already agitated heart could not hold out against the high fever, he, too, was dead within 5 days. Escorted by quite a respectable number of his fellow citizens, he joined his wife in the Castorp family grave, a very beautiful plot in the cemetery of St. Catherine's Church, with a view to the botanical garden. His own father, the senator, survived him, if only by a little, and during the brief period until his death, likewise caused by pneumonia, against which he struggled amid great agony, for unlike his son, Hans Lorenz Castorp was a man firmly rooted in life, a tree hard to fell. During this brief period of a mere year and a half, then, the orphaned Hans Castorp lived in his grandfather's house, which had been built on a narrow lot on the esplanade in the early years of the century just past. Its Nordic classical facade, painted a dreary, weather-beaten color, was adorned by pilasters at both sides of the front door, which was set in the center of the first floor and had 5 stairs leading up to it. The main level was topped off by 2 more stories, both with windows reaching to the floor and ornamented with wrought iron grills. The first floor was taken up exclusively by formal rooms, including the bright dining room, with its ornamental plaster and 3 windows hung with burgundy curtains and looking out on the little back garden, where, during those 18 months, the grandfather and grandson dined together daily at 4 in the afternoon, served by old Fita, who had rings in both ears, silver buttons on his swallowtail coat, and a batiste necktie, exactly like the one worn by his master, in which, also in imitation of his master, he buried his clean-shaven chin, and whom the grandfather always addressed familiarly in Plattdeutsch, not for any comical effect, for he was a man without humor, but, quite matter-of-factly, just as he did whenever he dealt with the common folk. Warehouse workers, messengers, coachmen, or servants. Hans Castorp enjoyed listening to the dialect, and also enjoyed Fita's answers likewise in Plattdeutsch, delivered while serving from the left and bending around behind his master to speak into his right ear, out of which the senator heard considerably better than the left. The old man understood and nodded, and went on eating, sitting very erect between the high mahogany back of his chair and the table, barely bending forward to his plate. And his grandson, seated opposite, would watch with silent, profound, and unconscious attention, as his grandfather's hands, beautiful, white, gaunt, aged hands, with rounded, sharply tapered fingernails, and a green signet ring on the right forefinger, arranged a bite of meat, vegetable, and potato on the tip of the fork with a few practiced motions, and guided it to the mouth with just the least forward tip of the head. Hans Castorp looked down at his own still awkward hands, and sensed stored within them the possibility that one day he would hold and use his knife and fork as adeptly as his grandfather. It was quite another matter whether he would ever be able to bury his chin in such a necktie, so that it filled the wide opening created by his grandfather's peculiarly shaped collar, whose pointed tips brushed the old man's cheeks, because for that you would have to be as old as he was. And even in those days, no one far and wide wore such collars and neckties, except him and his old Fita. What a shame it was, because little Hans Castorp was delighted by the way his grandfather could rest his chin in the high snow-white necktie, and even as an adult the memory of it pleased him no end. There was something about it that found approval in the very depth of his soul. When they were finished eating and had folded their napkins, rolling them up and pushing them through their silver rings, a procedure that Hans Castorp managed only with difficulty, because the napkins were as large as small tablecloths, the senator would rise from his chair while Fita pulled it back, and then walk, shuffling his feet as he went, to the den to fetch a cigar. Sometimes his grandson would follow him. The den was the result of the dining rooms having been designed with 3 windows, so that it extended across the full width of the house, thus leaving no space for 3 drawing rooms, as was usual with this style of house, but only for 2, one of which, placed at right angles to the dining room, would have been disproportionately deep with only 1 window to the street. This was why 1/4 of its length had been partitioned off, forming the quote-unquote den, a dim, narrow room, lit by a skylight and furnished with only a few items: a whatnot stand for the senator's cigar cabinet, a card table with a drawer full of enticing objects, a deck of whist cards, game tokens, score cards with little hinged stands, a slate and chalk styluses, paper cigar holders, and other things too. And finally, set back in one corner, a rococo china cabinet made of rosewood with yellow silk curtains pulled across the inside of its window panes. "Grandpa," little Hans Castorp might say when they were in the den, raising himself on tiptoe, stretching to reach the old man's ear, "please show me the baptismal bowl." And his grandfather, who had already pushed back the long, soft flap of his frock coat and pulled a bundle of keys from his trouser pocket, now opened the china cabinet, from whose interior rose a fragrance the boy found both strange and pleasant. All sorts of objects that had fallen out of use, which made them all the more captivating, were kept inside. A pair of sinuous silver candlesticks, a broken barometer, its case carved with figures, an album of daguerreotypes, a cedar chest for liqueurs, a little Turk in a bright silk costume, whose body was rigid to the touch but contained a mechanism that, though it had long since fallen into disrepair, had once enabled him to run across the table, a model of an old-fashioned ship, and way at the bottom, a rat trap no less. But from the middle shelf, the old man took a heavily tarnished, round silver bowl, set on a silver plate, and showed the boy both pieces, separating them and turning them both about in his hands, all the while reciting a story he had told many times before. The bowl and plate were not originally a set, as one could plainly see, and as the boy was now instructed yet again. But they had been used together, his grandfather said, for around 100 years now, ever since the bowl had been acquired. The bowl was beautiful, its lines simple and elegant, fashioned according to the austere taste of the early years of the last century. Smooth and massive, it rested on round feet, its interior lined with gold, though the yellow luster had faded with the years. The only ornamentation was an embossed wreath of roses and serrated leaves around its rim. As for the plate, one could read its much greater age right on its surface. There stood 1650, in ornate numbers, and framing the date were all sorts of curlicued engraved lines, done in the quote-unquote modern fashion of the period, bombastic and capricious arabesques, and crests that were half stars, half flowers. The underside, however, was inscribed in a variety of ever-changing scripts with the names of those heads of the household who had been its owners over the course of time. There were 7 names in all now, each rounded out with the date of inheritance, and the old man with the white necktie pointed with his ringed forefinger as he read off each of them to his grandson. His father's name was there, as was in fact his grandfather's and his great-grandfather's. And now that syllable came doubled, tripled, and quadrupled from the storyteller's mouth. And the boy would lay his head to one side, his eyes fixed and full of thoughts, yet somehow dreamily thoughtless, his lips parted in drowsy devotion, as he would listen to the great, 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 that somber sound of the crypt and buried time, which nevertheless both expressed a reverently preserved connection of his own life in the present to things now sunk deep beneath the earth, and simultaneously had a curious effect on him, the same effect visible in the look on his face. The sound made him feel as if he were breathing the moldy, cool air of St. Catherine's Church, or the crypt in St. Michael's, as if he could sense the gentle draught of places where as you walked, hat in hand, you fell into a certain reverential forward-rocking motion, your heels never touching the ground. And he also thought he could hear the remote, cloistered silence of those reverberating spaces. At the sound of those somber syllables, religious feelings got mixed up with the sense of death and history, and all of it together somehow left the boy with a pleasant sensation. Indeed, it may well have been that it was solely for the sake of that sound, just to hear it and join in reciting it, that he had once again asked to be allowed to see the baptismal bowl. Then his grandfather would put the basin back on its tray, and let the boy look into its smooth golden hollow, which began to shimmer as it caught the light falling from above. "And it will soon be 8 years now," he said, "since we held you over it, and the water with which you were baptized trickled down into it. Lassen, the sexton from St. Jacob's, poured it into the cupped hands of our good Pastor Bugenhagen, and then it ran down over your hair and into the bowl here. But we had warmed it first so that you wouldn't be frightened and start crying, and you didn't either, quite the contrary. You had been bawling beforehand, making it difficult for Bugenhagen to give his homily. But then came the water, and you fell silent, and that was out of respect for the Holy Sacrament, let us hope. And in a very few days now, it will be 44 years since your dear departed father was the baby being baptized, and the water ran down from his head into this same bowl. That happened here, in his parents' home, across the way in the drawing-room, in the front of the middle window. And it was old Pastor Hezekiel who baptized him, the same one who almost got himself shot by the French when he was a young man, for preaching against their looting and burning. He's been resting in the Lord for a long, long time now. But 75 years ago, it was me they baptized, that was in the drawing-room too, and they held my head over this same bowl, sitting on its tray here, and the pastor spoke the same words that were spoken over you and your father, and warm, clear water ran down over my hair, too. There wasn't much more of it in those days than I have on my head now, and flowed into this golden basin." The boy looked up at his grandfather's narrow gray head, which was bent over the bowl, again just as it had been in that long-vanished hour he was talking about, and a familiar feeling stole over him, a strange, half-dreamy, half-scary sense of standing there and yet being tugged away at the same time, a kind of fluctuating permanence that meant both a return to something and a dizzy, everlasting sameness, a feeling that he knew well from previous occasions, and that he had been waiting for, hoping it would touch him again. It was partly for the sake of that feeling that he had contrived to have this abiding, mutable heirloom shown to him. When considering it later as a young man, he realized that the image of his grandfather was imprinted much more deeply, clearly, and significantly in his memory than that of his parents, and this may possibly have had its basis both in mutual sympathy and a special physical affinity, because the grandson did look like his grandfather, to the extent that a lad with down on his rosy cheeks can resemble a sallow and stiff septuagenarian. Probably the most significant factor, however, was that without question the old man had been the central figure in the family, its picturesque personality. From the viewpoint of the outside world, time had made Hans Lorenz Castorp's character and convictions obsolete long before his passing. He was a most Christian gentleman, a member of a reformed parish, with strict traditional opinions, so stubborn an advocate of restricting qualifications for those who governed the aristocracy, that it was as if he were living in the 14th century, when, against the dogged resistance of the old free patricians, tradesmen had first begun to win seats and voices in the town council. In sum, a man who opposed anything new. His active years had come during decades of violent expansion and numerous upheavals, decades of progress at a forced march, all of which constantly demanded great public courage and sacrifice. But it had not been old Castorp's fault, God knows, that the modern spirit had enjoyed its celebrated, brilliant victories. He had held the customs of his forefathers and their old institutions in far higher regard than any expansion of the harbor at breakneck speed, or the godless tomfooleries of a great city, had impeded and tempered wherever he could. And had it been up to him, the city administration nowadays would look just as old-fashioned and idyllic as his office had looked when he was in his prime. And this was how the old man was viewed, both during his lifetime and after, by his fellow citizens. And even though little Hans Castorp understood nothing about the affairs of government, the perceptions gained by his own calm, alert child's eye were much the same. Unspoken and therefore uncritical perceptions, though enthusiastic for all that, which when they later became conscious memories, retained their exclusively positive stamp, immune to all discussion or analysis. As noted, mutual sympathy was at work here, the kind of family affection and affinity of personality that not infrequently leaps a generation. Children and grandchildren observe in order to admire, and they admire in order to learn and develop what heredity has stored within them. Senator Castorp was tall and gaunt. The years had bent his back and neck, but he attempted to compensate for this by pressing against the curvature, which pulled down the corners of his mouth in a kind of painful dignity, while the lips, with no supporting teeth behind them, rested on bare gums. He wore his dentures only to eat. And this counter-pressure, which presumably also helped him steady his head because it had begun to shake of late, was probably what caused him to carry himself with an austere forward tilt, and to prop his chin in the way that so pleased little Hans. He loved his snuff. He had a longish tortoise-shell box inlaid with gold, and snuff was also the reason he carried red handkerchiefs, the tip of one usually visible, dangling from the back pocket of his frock coat. And although this harmless vice added a jaunty touch to his appearance, the kind of carelessness that age either consciously and merrily permits itself, or brings with it cloaked in dignified oblivion. In any case, it was the only such carelessness in his grandfather's appearance that little Hans Castorp's sharp eye ever observed. Both to the mind of the 7-year-old and in the memories of the adult, the everyday appearance of the old man was not what was essential and real about him. His essential reality was quite different, much more handsome and authentic than his everyday appearance. That reality, you see, was found in a painting, a life-size portrait, that at one time had been hung in the living room of Hans Castorp's parents, and had been transported along with the boy to the house on the esplanade, where it had been given a spot above the large red silk sofa in the parlor. It showed Hans Lorenz Castorp in his official dress as a town councillor, the sober, even godly attire of citizens from a vanished century, a costume that later citizens, whether staid or dashing, had carried with them through the years, continuing to wear it on pompous occasions in order ceremoniously to make the past present, and the present past, and to proclaim the permanent continuity of all things, and the venerable trustworthiness of their official signatures. There, large as life, Senator Castorp stood on a red-tiled floor, against a perspective of columns and Gothic arches. There he stood, his chin lowered, his mouth drawn down, his blue, thoughtful eyes, the bags heavy beneath them, directed into the distance. He was clad in a robe-like black jacket, hanging open at the front, edged in fur along the hem and lapels, and reaching well below his knees. Emerging from under its wide, braid-trimmed, puffy sleeves was a second set of tight-fitting sleeves of simpler fabric, ending in lace cuffs that covered the hands to the knuckles. He had pulled black silk stockings over his skinny old man's legs, and on his feet he wore shoes with silver buckles. Around his neck, however, lay a wide, starched, heavily pleated ruff, slanted forward but sloping upward on both sides, beneath which, to top it all, could be seen a pleated batiste jabot and a vest. Under one arm, he carried an old-fashioned, broad-brimmed hat that tapered to a point. It was a splendid portrait, painted by a renowned artist, executed tastefully in the style, as suggested by its subject, of the old masters, and awakening in the observer all sorts of images of the late Middle Ages in the Spanish Netherlands. Little Hans Castorp had often studied it, not with any artistic acumen, of course, but with a certain more general, even penetrating understanding. And although he had only once seen his grandfather in real life in the fashion pictured there on canvas, just for a brief moment as part of a dignified procession into the town hall, he could not help, as we have said, regarding this pictorial presence as his authentic and real grandfather, seeing in the everyday one a temporary, imperfectly adapted improvisation, so to speak. From that perspective, the lapses and eccentricities in his everyday appearance were apparently mere imperfections or inept adaptations, were the vestiges or hints of a pure and true nature that could not be totally eradicated. Granted, his stiff collar and high, white necktie were old-fashioned, but such a term could never be applied to that marvelous article of clothing he meant the Spanish ruff, of which the former were merely present-day traces. And it was the same with the peculiar rounded top hat that his grandfather wore in public, and which on some higher plane of reality corresponded to the broad-brimmed felt hat in the picture, or the long pleated frock coat whose genuine prototype little Hans Castorp found in the fur and braid-trimmed robe. And so, when the day came to say farewell, in his heart of hearts, little Hans Castorp was relieved to see his grandfather decked out in his authentic perfection. It was in the dining room, the same room where they had so often sat across the table from one another. In the middle of the room, Hans Lorenz Castorp now lay in a silver-trimmed coffin, atop a bier surrounded and besieged with wreaths. He had battled pneumonia to the end, had battled long and obstinately, even though, to all appearances, he had accommodated himself only in part to contemporary life. But now, here he lay in state. One could not be sure whether triumphant or vanquished, but in any case with a stern, satisfied look on his face, though it was greatly changed, his nose looking pinched after his struggles, his lower body shrouded under a coverlet on which lay a palm frond, his head propped up on the silk pillow so that his chin rested most handsomely in the indentation at the front of the ceremonial ruff. And in his hands, half hidden by lace cuffs, the fingers looking cold and inanimate despite their artificially natural pose, someone had placed an ivory cross, upon which his eyes, beneath their lowered lids, seemed to be fixed. Hans Castorp had seen his grandfather several times in the early stages of his last illness, but then no more toward the end. He had been spared any sight of the struggle, which had taken place primarily at night, and had been touched by it only indirectly, the anxious atmosphere in the house, old Fita's reddened eyes, the comings and goings of doctors. But from its outcome, which he now found displayed before him in the dining room, he gathered that his grandfather had now received solemn dispensation from his interim stage, and had finally returned to the form appropriate to him. An event of which he could only approve, though old Fita wept and constantly shook his head, even though Hans Castorp himself wept, just as he had wept at the sight of his unexpectedly deceased mother, and a short time later of his father lying there, equally serene and strange. For this was now the third time within so few months, and at such a young age, that little Hans Castorp's mind and senses had been affected by death. His senses in particular. The sight of it, the impression it left, was no longer new to him, but really quite familiar. And just as on the first two occasions, he had behaved responsibly and kept his composure, with no sign of nervous weakness, although much distressed, as is only natural. He did so now as well, but to an even greater degree. Unaware of the practical implications of these events on his life, or perhaps regarding them with childish indifference while trusting that the world would take care of him one way or another, he betrayed a similarly childish reserve and businesslike attentiveness when viewing coffins, which, on this third occasion, took on nuances of precociousness, both in his emotional reaction to the look of knowledge and experience on his face, it being unnecessary likewise to describe his natural reaction of being caught up in the frequent tearful outbursts of others. Within 3 or 4 months after his father died, he had forgotten death. Now he remembered it, and all the impressions from before re-emerged simultaneously, in every precise, piercing, and incomparable detail. Analyzed and put into words, his feelings might have been expressed as follows. There was something religious, gripping, and sadly beautiful, which was to say, spiritual, about death, and at the same time, something that was the direct opposite, something very material, physical, which one could not really describe as beautiful or gripping or religious, or even as sad. The religious, spiritual side was expressed by the pretentious lying in state, by the pomp of flowers and palm fronds, which he knew signified heavenly peace, and also, more to the point, by the cross between the dead fingers of what had been his grandfather, by the blessings a copy of Thorvaldsen's Christ extended from the head of the coffin, and by 2 towering candelabra on either side, which on an occasion like this also took on an ecclesiastical character. The explicit and well-intended purpose of all these arrangements was apparently to show that grandfather had now passed on forever to his authentic and true form. But they also served another purpose, one that little Hans Castorp likewise noted, if not admitting it to himself in so many words. In particular, the masses of flowers, and more especially, the very well represented tube roses, were there for a more sobering reason, and that was to gloss over the other side of death, the one that is neither beautiful nor sad, but almost indecent in its base physicality, to make people forget it, or at least not be reminded of it. It was this aspect of death that made his dead grandfather look so strange, not really like his grandfather at all, but like a life-size wax doll that death had slipped into the coffin in his place, and for which this whole solemn show was being put on. The man who lay there, or better, what lay there, was not grandfather himself, but a shell, which, as Hans Castorp knew, was not made of wax, but of its own material. It was just stuff, and that was what was indecent, and not so really even sad. No sadder than things that have to do with the body, and only with it, are sad. Little Hans Castorp gazed at the stuff out of which this life-size dead figure was made, at this waxy, yellow, smooth stuff, with the consistency of cheese, gazed at the face and hands of what had been his grandfather. And just then, a fly settled on the inert forehead, and began to move its proboscis up and down. Old Fita circumspectly shooed it off, though avoiding actually touching the forehead. A shadow of respectability darkened his face, as if he should not know and did not want to know what he was doing. An expression of propriety, which apparently was related to grandfather's being only a body and nothing more. All the same, after a long, looping flight, the fly came to rest again on grandfather's fingers, sitting up pertly very close to the ivory cross. And while all this was going on, Hans Castorp thought he could smell more clearly than before those faint but very peculiar and persistent fumes that he knew from before, and which, to his shame, always reminded him of a school-chum who suffered from an offensive affliction that made everyone avoid him. The same odor that the tuberose scent was supposed to cover up on the sly, but he was unable to do so for all its lovely, austere richness. He returned several times to stand by the body, one time all alone except for old Fita, a second time with his great-uncle Tinapel, the wine merchant, and his 2 uncles James and Peter, And then a third time as well, when a group of workmen from the harbor, in their Sunday best, stood for a few moments beside the coffin to take leave of the former head of the house of Castorp and Son. Then came the funeral, and a dining room full of people, dressed in his Spanish ruff. Pastor Bugenhagen from St. Michael's, the man who had baptized Hans Castorp, performed the service, and afterward he spoke to little Hans Castorp in very friendly tones as they sat together on the coach, the one right behind the hearse, and the first in a long, long procession. And with that, this part of Hans Castorp's life came to an end as well, and a very short time later he changed homes and neighborhoods, for the second time now in his young life.